everybody. Good morning to CSL Denver. Great to see everyone here in the room. For those of you who are online, great to see you. Maybe I don't see you, but maybe we are exchanging energy on some level as well. It's just great to be here. And whether you're watching online live or you're watching on the recording, we just know that this time together is a blessing. I hope that this message this morning serves you and is beneficial for your lives. Before I get into the message, however, I do want to mention a couple of things that may be of interest to you. Many of you may know that I serve as the Vice President for the Science of Mind Archives, and I'm one of their key researchers. And I think what I've been here before, I've mentioned the fact that we helped compile and wrote the intro for the Ernest Holmes at a Silvermar book, which was all of his lectures from that time in the 1950s when he spoke and taught at Silvermar. I work on a lot of other projects as well, and one of those was reviewing and posting Ernest Holmes audios online for the archives. And through that project, we discovered some audios that we realized were parts of his TV show that he did in the 1950s. And that led to some curiosity on my own part and research leading to finding, when did this program run? How did it run? What's the story behind it? And when the Science of Mind Archives moved recently to Unity Village, I was blessed to be able to do a presentation there where we shared some of the findings I had uncovered regarding Ernest Holmes' short-lived TV show. And that has then since led to an article in the current Science of Mind. So the one that you've got now, the July issue, has an article by myself about the history of Ernest Holmes and his use of the media with an emphasis on his TV show. So I call your attention to anyone who's out there who's interested in the history like I am of Holmes and this movement, to find that article and to read it in concert with other things that you know about this teaching. And from that, we're also doing a presentation on behalf of the Science of Mind Archives. It's coming out on July 24th. It will be online. This online presentation is done. And if you're a friend of the archive in terms of supporting them, it's a free gift to you. If you're not, you can either become a friend or you can actually pay for the program as well. And we're going to be playing clips from the one known video of the program. We're going to be playing clips from the audios of other discovered TV shows. We're going to be showing some graphics and material relative to the background and history of the show, the recording process, etc. I personally, as sort of a geek on history, I find it great, fascinating, and interesting, and I hope you do too. If you find that interesting, go to the Science of Mind Archives website, scienceofmindarchives.com. There's information on their homepage about that presentation and how you can sign up. If you're a friend of the archive, you're going to get an email asking you or giving you info on how to RSVP for it. That's it. Let's get into today's talk. As Rumi mentioned, the talk's entitled E Pluribus Unum. And we all know that statement because it's on our great seal of the U.S. It's on many of our coins. It's on much of our currency. And we have grown up with a flow of this phrase in the background of who we are. What's interesting to me, and I was thinking about this week when I was thinking about the talk that I wanted to give you relative to that, is it's the first time I've ever done a talk where my talk title was not English. And in fact, it's a Latin phrase, which made me reflect on the fact of my high school days when you could take Latin. And I did not take Latin. Back when I was in high school and they offered it, I felt like nobody really spoke Latin, and was that really going to be beneficial for me? So I spent my foreign language coin, as you see, on Spanish. Now, I know a lot more Spanish words, but I wish I could speak Spanish fluently, but I at least know a lot of phrases. I know very little Latin. And so this message today won't be like an old Catholic sermon where everything was in Latin, but it will be in English. And I'm only going to be referencing the phrase E Pluribus Unum pretty much right now, and referencing, just as Rumi mentioned, that it means out of the many, one. Out of the many, one. Now, that is sort of something that we are all aware of because of the historical aspect of the United States. And what we're going to talk about this morning is the U.S. piece of it and our implementation of that phrase within the consciousness of this country. But I want to meld into later on this morning talking about the metaphysical aspects of it and how it melds into science of mind in a way that Rumi so perfectly laid the stage for that. So it's moving from the physical world to the spiritual world, as you would, through this process this morning. As we look at the history of the phrase, where did it come from? When was it instituted? Well, it really came about right after the formation of our country. It was a phrase was actually originated by an immigrant. It was an individual who was born in Geneva, the Republic of Geneva, which is south part of Switzerland. He was of French origin, and he immigrated to the United States, and the country, the new fledgling country, hired him as a consultant to help them with design ideas regarding many of the things of the early country, including the Great Seal. And it was this aspect of it that this individual came forward and recommended a phrase, e pluribus unum. E pluribus unum had been used historically prior to that, but not in the context that it was with the U.S. and its Great Seal, and then how we've used it on our currency and so forth. Now, originally, the meaning of the phrase referenced the fact that we had 13 different colonies that were coming together as one country. And in fact, the phrase itself is 13 letters long. And so those 13 letters stood at that time, and for many years, it stood as a representation of the very disparate kind of colonies that had come to this new land with a new idea for how they wanted to express their freedoms and who they were. Different countries of origin, different, in many cases, languages, different religions, different ideas. There was one dream. One dream was to set about a new life. And that dream got melded into the dream of a new country through the process of the formation of the United States. But the interesting thing is that although the phrase originated as a means of uniting 13 different colonies into one nation, it's actually taken on a life of its own. And that phrase, coupled with a couple of other things, the very inclusive language that we find not only in our Constitution, but especially in the Declaration of Independence, when we speak about the fact that all men are created equal and are endowed with by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that this kind of inclusive language set the stage for a very inclusive country. It set the stage for an ideal that we have been working towards and moving towards throughout our history. An ideal that we can very easily recognize we've not yet met the ideal, but are continuously moving closer to it. Much like when Rumi talked about the quote from Martin Luther King in the arc of justice ever bending upward, our upward nature of our country has ever been more and more towards a higher and greater sense of inclusivity. But we're not there yet. Now, if we look back over this historically, we can sort of break down the sentence, out of the many, one, is it offers us in our humanness to hold two divergent ideas at the same time. And that's hard for a lot of us, is to see things that seem to be opposites, but they're really united. Even when we teach in science of mind that it was out of the one that we have the multiplicity of life, it's hard for us sometimes to wrap our minds around, are we one or are we a multiplicity? Are we the many or are we the one? And in consciousness, we have to hold these two ideas simultaneously. Now, for our country, historically, it's caused us to really recognize when we talk about the out of the many, who are the many that we're allowing into the one? Because the ones we're allowing into the one, what do they get by being part of the one? They get all of the freedoms and the high vision of this country. They get the opportunity to express themselves, to pursue happiness, even though we know happiness is within us and is always there. But the opportunity through our lives to learn and grow and to recognize the happiness that is already there. Who gets that freedom to do that? And so we've always wrestled with and had an aspect where we're continuously changing. You know, there's a degree of irony when we look back on it, is these very inclusive statements that we find in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and the acceptance of a motto that says, out of the many, one, came from actually a minority of this country. It was actually white, Anglo-Saxon, Christian men, landowners who came up with very inclusive language. And if we look back at the time in the late 1700s, that out of that many that created that statement was actually a minority of the country. And it's only over time that we've more and more become more inclusive in adding to and saying, who are the many that can partake of the gifts of this one country? Sometimes that grows and sometimes it shrinks. Sometimes it grows and sometimes it shrinks. Now, this leads me to a couple of metaphysical concepts I want to introduce at this point as we look at our history aspect of this message this morning. There's one metaphysical concept that's taught in Science of Mind, is a concept of evolution. And you might say, well, evolution's not a metaphysical concept. We teach evolution in our schools. Well, what we teach in biology of evolution is a physical evolution. Well, what's taught in our spiritual centers and in Science of Mind and in many metaphysical classes and communities is that evolution is a process whereby the one spirit, God, embedded itself into its form, and its form is evolving back to remembering the truth of its origin. So the process of it placing itself into form is called involution, and the process by which the form moves back into through greater and greater levels of awareness and knowing its oneness and its source and unity is the process of evolution. And so we in the midst of this country are ever moving forward or upward in the process of evolution and remembering our truth, remembering our unity, remembering that we are all part of this one whole. So as we look back over the history of the country, we can see sort of like a stock market chart where things go up and then they slide and then they go up and they slide. And we can see the slides, but there is time when we step back and look at the overall arc of the path of our history, that the continuing arc is ever upward in the more inclusivity of including more and more people in the many that we incorporate into this one country. Now, there's another process that's at play as well. And the other process, this metaphysical process that's taught in metaphysical circles and by many individuals, is the fact that everything is moving through a state of rhythm. Everything moves back and forth like a pendulum swing. And in fact, if you take an ever upward arc and you take a pendulum and you map them, what you get is a spiral of things going back and forth, but ever moving upward. And very often, Ernest Holmes wrote about the ever upward of life serving much like a spiral, recognizing that we had this waxing and waning. So how does this play out in this e pluribus unum country of ours? It means that at times, the pendulum swings. Sometimes the pendulum swings to higher and greater degrees of inclusivity so that the numbers of people that we include in the many grow. And there's times the pendulum swings and we contract. It appears that sometimes the people who are included in the many shrink. And we can look back over the history of our country and we can say, well, yes, definitely in the very beginning days with slavery and things of that nature, there was a very smaller group of people. But by the end of the Civil War and the end of slavery, there had been an arc or movement within the pendulum to include more. But then as we followed that by the days of Jim Crow rules in our country, there was a degree of shrinkage. But then we had the Civil Rights Act in the 60s, which seemed to expand our inclusivity. So we have this waxing and waning going in terms of the racial divide and the rights of people with different skin colors. But it's not only in that group. We can also look at it from the standpoint that women did not initially have the right to vote. And in many cases, women were seen as second-class citizens in this country. But over many years, a period of time, and especially in the late 1800s and early 1900s, an act to expand the rights and include into the many women those rights to become part of the one that had previously not been included. And that's continued to expand, but we can also see times through Supreme Court rulings where sometimes those rights get expanded and sometimes they get shrunk. We can also take it and look at Are we inclusive and open to the entire, opening our borders to the vast diversity of people on this planet? There's many times in our country's history, that we've shrunk the borders and limited people who can come here. And there's times we've expanded it and said, and we welcome more. There has been this waxing and waning and a shifting of a pendulum that's been playing out in our country throughout its history. And there are times that we can celebrate that many expanding, and there's times that we can see, and for many of us who are in this philosophy and see the unity of all people and all life, can feel concerned over the shrinkage that might occur in our country in expanding. But we have to also focus on the fact that the ever upward arc is upward. That even though we may have temporary swings of the pendulum where things are not as we might want them to be, that the pendulum always swings back in some form or fashion. More on that as we get through it. You know, it's kind of interesting. There's one other saying that is often associated with the United States and turns up on our coins, and that phrase is, "In God we trust." And in fact, it is the official motto, quote unquote, of the United States. Originally, E Pluribus Unum was the first motto that we used. It was never made the official motto, but it ended up on a coinage. The "In God We Trust" came later, really came in more to form in the 1800s. Historians cite that there was a force within the United States, which still exists, of people who want to say that our great country, where out of the many we're one, that the many should reflect that we're a Christian nation. And there's always been a body of people who make that statement. Now, we have a lot of people who believe in the Christian faith, but there's always been a recognition that we're more than that we include other faiths. We include those who don't believe in God. We believe those who are in the secular or atheistic vision of life, that is what their truth is for them. And they can be included out of the many one. We can see, no matter what your faith is in terms of religion and your beliefs about the meaning of life, you can be incorporated in that. But what happens when we go, and there was a lobbying of Lincoln, he resisted the claim to make us called a Christian nation, but he did allow coinage to have an expanded use of the phrase, "In God we trust." And then that was for many years. And then there was a major move in the 1950s. Again, that pendulum swinging. And in the 1950s, there was a large movement among Christian ministers to make that the official motto of the United States. It wasn't actually until the 1950s under the Eisenhower administration that "In God We Trust" became the motto of the United States. But the two mottos sit there hand in hand. And, you know, at first, I know personally, I was sort of, when I was growing up and looking at the coinage, and I said, well, what about people who don't believe in God? You know, what do they look when they see a coin that says "In God We Trust"? And that used to bother me, I'll be honest. But then as I came to Science of Mind and I sort of expanded my version of what God is, that sort of went away. And so I have it now when I look at "In God We Trust." God to me ends up being sort of like you ever do an algebra equation where you have X standing for something and you solve for X? Sometimes you can read "In X we trust." In X we trust. And the question then becomes, God is just some letters there, like X, that's standing for "in whatever you trust in." In whatever you trust in. Many of our people, when they hear the word God, they want to say that God represents this vision of an old bearded man who lives in the clouds. It's exemplified by the Sistine Chapel ceiling and, you know, the outstretched hand. It's an external being. It's somebody separate from us. It's somebody that judges us and, you know, is there, and we pray to this external person to interact in our lives. And many people, that when we talk about many people who believe in God, that's the vision that they have. And we have many atheists who say, "I don't believe in God." That's the vision of God that they say they don't believe in. So when people come to Science of Mind and we talk about God, many people, "Well, I don't know about this God stuff you're talking about." But we have to stop and explain that the God that we teach in Science of Mind is a more inclusive God, a God that is within us. It's a power, a presence, an intelligence, a force an energy. It can go by many names. We often use spirit, the thing itself, the all, everything. We can call it X. We can call it Y or whatever you want in solving the equation. So in X we trust. What is it in which you trust? You trust in a divine presence and force that's behind the universe, that's given rise to all of our existence. If you believe in that as God, then in God we trust. Makes sense. If you believe that everything is material and we believe in the rules of science and logic and everything is just simply physical matter, if you're an agnostic or atheist and secular person who believes in that, then that can be your X. And when you see the word God, let your belief in life and what you trust in stand for that. But the irony for me in this is that the very nature of this other phrase coming up is also representative of that pendulum shifting about, are we a Christian nation or are we not? And when we move towards the arc of trying to define ourselves as being quote unquote Christian, nothing wrong with it with true teachings of Christ, and we'll be very clear with that. And that the Christ consciousness that we teach here is within each and every one of us. And so I personally can say we're a Christian nation, but in the common vernacular of people's understandings, sometimes they want to shrink the many to fit into what their idea of Christianity is. So again, it gets back to what's God and what's Christianity and how do we define it. And if you're serving to limit the people you're allowing into the tent of the many to play in the goodness and the gifts of the all of this country, then I would say that you're on the wrong side of that arc of moral justice. Because we really are moving towards a more inclusive, a more understanding world that represents that everything is one. Now, I'm going to shift here, because what I've really been talking about up to this point is that out of the many, one has served as a shift in consciousness for the planet, that as humans around the world have looked for their highest and greatest expression, they've looked to this country, the United States, and said, and defined it as the great shining city on the hill that we hold up as an example to the world of what we can be. But we're made up of humans, and we have this rhythm of waxing and waning, of expanding the all and the many, and the shrinkage of it. And I know many of us feel concerned because right now in the world, it appears that we're in one of those pendulum shifts towards shrinkage, towards limiting who's the many that we're going to allow to have the freedoms of the all. And so then that raises a question for us, because if our vision is that the many is everyone, and that's what we teach here, then we don't want to shrink it. We want to continue to expand it. And not only open it up and expand it, but that the freedoms and protections and the abilities to live the greatest life and to live our fullest life and find our life purpose and to express it in life, we want it not only for people who are citizens and residents of the United States, but we want it for every person on this planet. Now, that leads us to the fact that all of this that I've been talking about is happening in one of a couple of realms in which we live and move and have our being. And I'm now shifting sort of like the spiritual, metaphysical side of things a little bit more. We always talk about the fact that we are spiritual beings having a human experience. And those of you who've heard me talk before, I always come here and say, we're living in multiple worlds simultaneously, that we are day to day looking out here in this physical world, in the world of politics, and we are thinking about it in the world of our minds and giving our ideas and judgment to the world of form or the material world. So right now, physical, material world, we sort of stay playing out, and then in our minds, we're looking at that and having ideas about it and judgments about it and so forth. But there's a higher realm that's our real truth. And that's where that true ideal is, and that's the realm of spirit, or God, or the one. Because if you remember a minute ago, I said it was out of the one came the many, as Rumi talked about. Out of God or spirit came through the process of involution everything that we know and sense in the world of form, who is now evolving back in its awareness to remembering that oneness. That's the path we're all on. It's the hero's journey that every one of us are involved with in our own life. we're all involved in however you play it out towards a remembrance of your wholeness of the oneness of all of life. Okay. Now, as you do and move through this process, so is everybody else. They appear to be separate from you, but we're all one. And in their individualized expressions, as Holmes defined it, we're not individuals. He called us, we're individualized expressions, because the word individual seems to make a separation or a barrier between you and me. But if we're individualized expressions, what he's trying to get at by saying that phrase is that there's a oneness, an energy, a flow of which we're all moving and having our being. But we've sort of put a little permeable barrier around ourselves and expressing as this part of the one. And our part of the one is trying to remember our oneness. And that's where we're all going. And so as we look out at life and we think about out of the many, one, it's playing out not only in the world of form through our country, which we then judge and think about in the realm of the mind, and it's been driven by a vision or an ideal that came to us from spirit. I have no doubt that the individual who came up with Pluribus Unum and the founding fathers of this country were divinely inspired by spirit to come up with the ideas that would guide us, to nudge us along our evolutionary path to remember our oneness. But our humanness bumps into our spiritual nature over and over, and causing this pendulum swing in our awareness and in our political systems as to who we can see as part of the one. Is it people who look and think and feel and act? Is it me, just as I am? Or is it everyone? And I have to be open to the everyone. So this leads us, when we recognize it, to seeing we're called to live in two realms at one time. We're called, in fact, I look at it sometimes that if you look at it like a three-layer cake, spiritual, mental, physical. Here in the middle, we're in our mental, and we have an ability to choose which way we're going to focus. We can look up to God and spirit and get guidance from the ideals of where we know we're heading in our evolution. Or we can look it down in the world of form and see the conflict and division and focus on that. We teach in Science of Mind that what we give our energy to is what we grow in our lives. What we resist persists. If we're resisting the world of form, we're going to get more of that. But if we can turn our vision higher to God and the Spirit and see the ideal that we're all one and can live from that vision, and that's the challenge, I acknowledge, but if we can live from that vision and bring it back into the world of form, then we can serve that evolutionary path for us and the changing of the pendulum to swinging forward so that we can see and create a world that works for all, which is, of course, one of the visions of Centers of Spiritual Living in total. So, where does this leave us this morning? Well, it leaves us with the fact that we're looking at two realms. And the interesting thing is, this is something I've been thinking about more and more lately, the fact that every religion, every faith, every type of spiritual / teaching of meaning serves in general two purposes. Whether you're going to a fundamentalist Christian church, a Jewish synagogue, a Muslim temple, if you're going wherever you're going, Catholic church, every church serves two purposes. The teachings should guide you to living in the world of form, the material world of people. They should give you guidance through our philosophy is what's the best thing for us to do in this world in which we find ourselves. Okay. That's one purpose of every religion, is to help us. And in fact, many people will stop right there. But there's also another purpose for every faith teaching. And that's to us to transcend this world. We're here not only to transform the world, but to transcend the world. In fact, in my mind, the cross represents that. The horizontal aspect of the cross to me represents the fact that we're here to transform this existence that we're finding ourselves muddling through. But the upward arc points us back to spirit, that we're ever upward moving and transforming our own lives to transcend this world. So the question then becomes, what are you, those of you watching this and those of you in the room, what are you doing to transform the world to a world that works for all? How are you showing up? You know, it's one thing to look at the political things that are going on in the world right now and complain about them and wish they were different and all of that, or celebrate them if you're on another end of the political spectrum. But all of this calls us to say, what is mine to do and be in this physical world? What do I truly believe? Do I truly believe that we're all one? Do I truly believe that every person, no matter what their skin color, their religion and beliefs, whatever their background is, their country of origin, their sex or sexual orientation, whatever it is, do I believe they're all part of the one and deserve to be included in the many that are part of the one? Do I? If I truly do, then what is mine to do and be? In many cases, we have to look at the sphere of influence that we have. And let's say, in this realm of life of myself, what behavior can I model? Where am I called to step up and to be in action? Where can I be a force that moves the pendulum back to more and higher, greater levels of inclusivity in this country and in the world? But we're more, remember? We're also called to transcend the world. And that leaves you with another question. What is yours to do or be? And are you taking steps in your own consciousness to recognize and sense that you are more than this? That everyone that you meet is more than this. Everyone that you interact with in our conversations in the world. It's God talking to God. It's spirit talking to spirit. And it's easy to forget that. So how can you navigate in a world that also allows you to sense the transcendence? To turn your eyes upward to God and spirit, and to let the ideals of spirit guide and drive your lives. Are you meditating? Are you having spiritual practices that remind you? If your daily affairs is getting up and turning on the news and staying in divisiveness and material stuff every day, and you're not taking time to practice transcending this, then you're going to stay stuck in this. You have to be doing something in your life. Yes, take the actions in the world of form, but also take those actions in your own life that call you to recognize that you and I are one, you and I and everyone are one, and you and I are more than the experience that we're moving through. And ask yourself, what is yours to do as you evolve upwards, I should say, as you move upwards towards remembering your truth that we're all one and that you are God expressing. We exist for the bliss and of the divine. Are you living a life of bliss for the divine? Are you remembering your truth? This day, as we go forward from here, I call all of us to act in the world, to create oneness, to see the many as one, but to also see the one in your own life, in the transcendence, that you are more than this world. Let's pray. As we move into the consciousness of the divine, as we take our words and shift into this sense of the higher aspect of life, as we turn upward in our mental realm, upward to the realm of spirit and accessing God, taste and touch into the divine flow, knowing that our lives are a gift, that this entire world and experience that we're moving through, all of the gifts that it gives us and all the things that we tend to complain about, that all of it is an opportunity for us to live in bliss and to create experiences for God of bliss and oneness. Are we moving that way? I know for each and every one of us this day that we show up in the world of form in a way that brings more love to the planet, more oneness to the planet, that sees and recognizes the unique value and gifts of every individualized expression of that one. But we also take time to recognize the oneness in us and to recognize that everything out there that we see in this world We're not only the witness witnessing it, but everything out there is inside of us. That there is a mystical truth that the mystics have laid out for us for so many years, and we are anchoring that in our awareness now. That each and every one of us who hear these words are called to living a life of oneness. Thank you, Spirit, for this time, for this ability, and for this wonderful, blissful experience. So it is.